welcome back. Imagine a time when spices and treasures from distant lands called to Europe, with eastern routes blocked by the Ottomans and Portugal controlling Africa's coasts. Spain turned west. Columbus embarked on his daring journey, sailing into the unknown and setting the stage for a new world. Christopher Columbus did UNTAX lead sail west because he was an idiot who did UNT know the world was round, or because he was trying to prove the world was flat. He sailed west because it was in his best interest to do so. See, in the late 1400s, Europeans were obsessed with spices. They loved cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper, and they wanted more of it. For centuries, they got their spices from the Middle East, but by the late 1400s, the Ottoman Empire controlled all of the land routes through Asia and into the Mediterranean, which meant that Europeans could no longer get the spices they craved, or at least they could unget them easily or cheaply. So some European countries decided to try and find a different way to get to Asia, specifically to the east. They wanted to find a sea route around or through Africa, or maybe even over the Arctic, to get to Asia and get their hands on some of those tasty spices. Because if they could get more spices, then they could sell those spices and make lots of money. And money makes the world go round. Or maybe back then it was spices that made the world go round. Anyway, the point is that European countries like Spain and Portugal started looking for a sea route to Asia. But while Spain and Portugal were looking east, the Ottoman Empire was looking south. They wanted to control the trade happening off the coast of Africa, and they began attacking ships, especially Portuguese ships. The Ottomans weren't just attacking these ships because they liked hurting people. They were doing it to control the trade routes. See, the lands around the Mediterranean weren't producing enough food for everyone living there. So the people in those lands needed to import food. And guess what? African countries had plenty of food to spare. In fact, North African countries like Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria had been trading with Europeans for centuries. They traded gold, ivory, leather, wool, cloth, precious stones, and of course, spices. Oh, and they also traded slaves. Europeans brought the Portuguese especially to Africa for one reason: slaves. The Portuguese would come to Africa with lots of manufactured goods and other stuff they thought Africans would want, and then they would trade those things for slaves. Then they took those slaves and sold them in Europe, or even better, in the Americas, where they could get even more money for them. Anyway, as I said before, the Ottomans wanted to control trade happening around Africa. And because the Portuguese were leading the charge in terms of European slave trading, the Ottomans attacked them a lot. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, wait a second, why don't we just avoid the Atlantic Ocean and go around Africa on the east side? Well, that was exactly what the Portuguese were doing. They were going around Africa, and they had set up trading posts along the way. But the Ottomans were making that difficult, which meant that the Portuguese were looking for another option, and that option was India. If they could get to India, they could start trading with the Indians directly and not have to worry about the Ottomans. And if they could get to India, then they could also get to China and Japan, to places where Europeans desperately wanted to trade. By the early 1400s, the Portuguese had begun conquering areas of modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. And in 1488, a Portuguese explorer named Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, proving that you could sail around the continent. Then, in 1497, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama arrived in India. having sailed around Africa, avoiding the Mediterranean entirely. The Portuguese were now in direct competition with the Arabs for the Indian spice trade. And Portugal was very happy about this, because it meant that they could get rich selling spices in Europe. So let me review quickly. Portugal was doing quite well in Africa. They were able to get to India, and they were planning on getting to China and Japan soon, too. So why did Portugal allow Spain to sail to the Americas? Well, Spain was unsailing to the Americas to compete with Portugal in Africa, or to trade with China or India. Spain wanted to find its own opportunities. Now, here's the thing. Back in 1474, Portugal and Spain had signed a treaty that divided non-European lands between them. Anything east went to Portugal. Anything west went to Spain. But there was a problem. No one really knew where the dividing line should be. Like, where exactly did the Americas fall? Portugal thought that the Americas were part of Asia, and if that was true, then Portugal would have claim to all of the lands in the Western Hemisphere. Spain thought that the Americas were their own separate continent, and if that was true, then Portugal shouldn't have any claim to any of them. So when Columbus approached the Spanish monarchs and asked for funding for his voyage, the Spanish were interested. And that's because Spain thought that if Columbus could reach Asia through the Americas, then Spain would be able to take some of Portugal's claim to future lands. Remember, the Spanish thought that the Americas were their own separate continent. So, if Columbus could get to Asia through the Americas, then it meant that the Americas weren't part of Asia. It meant that Spain could keep more of the wealth for itself. Okay? So why did Columbus go west? Well, because it was in his best interest to do so. He wanted to get to Asia, but he also wanted to help his country take land and wealth away from Portugal. And Spain thought that if Columbus could reach Asia through the Americas, then Spain would be able to do exactly that. Of course, as it turned out, Columbus never realized his goal of reaching Asia. He died believing that he was in India. But Spain didn't care. They had started taking land and resources from the Americas. And that's a whole other series that we'll talk about in another video. But what about the round Earth thing? Did Columbus think the Earth was flat? Did he not know that the Earth was round? Well, I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you that he definitely knew that the Earth was round. In fact, in one of his letters, he talks about how the shape of the Earth causes many distortions. He also wrote that merchants traveling in ships have to adjust for the curvature of the Earth when calculating distances. So yeah, I'd say he knew that the Earth was round. Then why did he sail west? Well, because he thought that if he sailed west, he would eventually hit land. But because the Earth is a sphere, instead of hitting land, he hit water, and he kept hitting water. And that's why he was so confused when he got back to Europe. He thought he was in India, but he had actually reached the Bahamas. And if you want to know more about how Europeans came to think that they were in India when they were actually in the Americas, then check out the video right here. It's a great video, I promise. Thanks for watching. Bye.